Hello. Today, I'm going to be doing my best books of 2022. Now, this is going to be a bit of a bumper ride for you. I was originally going to do this as like the 10 best books I read and the 10 most fun books I read, because I think both of those deserve their moment in the sun, and for very different reasons. However, I then wanted to add in a couple of extra bits. So not only have you got those 20 books, the best books I read and the most fun reads, you've also got my best short stories of the year, much smaller list, my top 3. The best classics I read, again, top 3. The best audiobooks I listened to this year, top 5. The best non-fiction I've read, top 3. And then my favourite translated fiction. So you've got quite a bumper set of books coming your way. So get a cup of tea and let's dig in. These are in no particular order. I've just sort of gone roughly chronologically, or just sort of thought, right, which books immediately come to mind as my favourite. So within these top 10, it's not like number 10 is going to be the bottom of the list and number 1 is the best. Like, it's just going to be the 10 best books. So let's start with my absolute favourites of the year. And we're going to have Rest and Be Thankful by Emma Glass. This was a really random one that I picked up. I think it was in a sale. I think I spent like £2 on it. But the cover had me drawn in, the blurb had me drawn in, and I'm really glad I read this. This is the book that now has sort of cemented in my mind the idea that I quite like poetic writing. I don't always like it, but I'm not as averse to it as I thought I was. This is lyrically written. The imagery is spectacularly done, but it's so dark as well. Like, the topics it covers are so dark. Like, it's really hard to recommend this. Like, I recommend everyone read it, but at the same time, the things that happen in it might mean that you don't necessarily want to recommend it to others, but I loved it, and I've now got her debut novella, Peach, as well to read, which I'm very excited to read, and I'm planning on reading that in 2023. So there's the first one. This second one, I wasn't sure whether to put on here because I read it really recently. I literally finished this a couple of days before Christmas, so like last week, but I can't stop thinking about it. And I keep I'm almost like trying to convince myself not to put it on this list by comparing it to others and saying, oh, what about this bit in this section and this bit in this section? But actually, every time I do it, it just cements this further as one of my favourite reads of the year. And in fact, if I was ranking this, I may well put this as number 1, because I think this spans both my favourite in terms of the writing and, you know, the literary nature of it, but also in terms of fun reads. Like, I really struggled to put this down. So this one could very easily have gone on my most fun reads of the year list as well, but this is going to stand the test of time in my mind. And this is the library book. I've yet to take back because I only finished it last week and it's been Christmas, but I need to get my own copy because I flippin' loved it. So yeah, there's number 2. The next one I want to talk about, I don't actually have on my shelves. It's one I borrowed from the library, but which I now really want to own, and that is Sealed by Naomi Booth. I've mentioned it in a couple of recent videos because I purchased this book for my Secret Santa, who's over in the US. Naomi Booth is an author that I've discovered this year. I've read The Lost Art of Sinking, Sealed, and I still have her book Exit Management on my TBR. I've got that from the library. It's the final one I want to read in my sort of Naomi Booth binge. Although she does also have a short story collection called Animals at Night, which I've seen getting quite a lot of traction on Bookstagram. I've seen quite a few people mentioning it, so maybe Naomi Booth is going to get her moment now. So Sealed follows a woman who has almost, not hypochondriac, but she has a big fear of germs. And we're living in a world that's slightly dystopian. So it's very much like our world, but ever so slightly heightened. So we have concepts such as clean food, which is all plastic wrapped and very carefully grown because other food has contaminants in it, and there's this illness that's going around that's causing body parts to seal up. So like your eyes will seal shut, your mouth will seal shut, and we're following this woman who is pregnant, and obviously there's a big fear that she's going to pass something to her baby, that she's going to get ill herself. Her and her husband or partner, I can't remember if they're married, but they move to the suburbs, like they move out into the country. And I think Women in Australia is never, I don't think, explicitly mentioned, but some of the language used, some of the terminology makes me feel like it's set in Australia, but that might just be like a feeling that I had. And then they're sort of realising that actually out there's no access really to healthcare, like all the doctor surgeries are shutting down because of all the major things that are happening in the cities. And it's just one of these where it's just these mounting tensions, and there's like horrendous body. There's like a scene in there. I was reading it on a train and I was literally just tensed up on the train, like, oh my God. But again, one of the most gripping, like even though I was on a busy train and it was packed because there were train strikes, so the few trains that were running were so busy, and yet I was so immersed in the world, like I was not distracted by what was going on around me at all. I was so in the story. So yeah, definitely one of my favourites of the year. The next one I want to mention is The Water Cure by Sophie McIntosh. So I read this one for my 2018 Booker Prize reading vlog, which you can see, I'll put it in the cards. It's one of those where when I read it, I wouldn't have necessarily thought it was going to be on my top list of 2022 books. But it stayed with me, and I keep thinking about it, and I keep going back to it and wanting to draw out other things that it does. And I don't own a copy. It's one I borrowed from the library, so I do really need to own a copy if I want to go back and do all the things that I want to do with it. But yeah, it's one of those where I think I could read it endless numbers of times and still get something different from it on each reading. So that's why it's on this list. So we're at the halfway point. We're on number 5, and that is going to be Normal People by Sally Rooney. Thank you to my Secret Santa for buying me a copy, or sending me their copy, I'm not sure, of this book, because I borrowed it from the library to read, but I do have it on my Kindle. But this is another book where I want to go back and reread and annotate and love it, so I asked for a copy. I put off reading Sally Rooney. So I had this, and I also have a second book by her. I have Beautiful World, Where Are You? But I was so like, she's such a hyped author that I really didn't want to read her, thinking I was going to hate it. And then, of course, I read it, and I am one of those people that just loved this. So I don't think I really need to go into it. We're in Ireland. We're following a couple who are sort of coming together and partying and coming together because of misunderstandings and mental health and all these things that make you frustrated, but at the same time it's very beautifully written. And I think I just really love Sally Rooney's writing style. So there's that one. Okay, number 6 is another prize nominated book. It is The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. I read this in the summer. So it's a sort of Greek myth adjacent retelling. So we're taking characters that we know, but we're giving voices to people who previously have just been side characters. I've seen a lot of people who did not like this. For some reasons that did have me thinking. So particularly the fact that we move to Odysseus's perspective sometimes in the book, even though it's supposed to be about giving a voice to the women rather than the main characters who have always had a voice. But I actually thought that it was quite a clever tension that was being built, where the male voices kept trying to come back in, kept trying to take over the narrative, but the women kept pulling it back. And so I thought that title of The Silence of the Girls was actually really well done and really well woven through it. That might have been accidental, that might not have been the intention at all, and other people's reviews of how it's slipping back into Odysseus's perspective being negative were valid, but I don't know. But yeah, so I think this was the Women's Prize 2019 nominated book. I don't think it won. Did it win? I can't remember. But anyway, I have a whole reading vlog for that as well, so you can check that out. The 7th book on this list is The Garden of Eden by Ernest Hemingway. This is his sort of unfinished novel that was published posthumously. I say unfinished, the story itself is finished, but it's very clear when you start reading it, it's very clear that it hasn't been self-edited, like the author hasn't gone in and edited it down. And in the introduction, at least to this copy, it does mention that the publishers publish it as is, except for, say, spelling corrections, to respect the author. I read this in June, so when I first started my YouTube channel. This, I feel, is ahead of its time. So this is Ernest Hemingway grappling with ideas of gender, and we have one of our main characters in here, a woman who's just got married, but she's struggling with feeling masculine at times, but also feminine at others. They end up bringing in this third woman, another woman, into their relationship. It causes arguments. I don't think they don't want to be in a polyamorous relationship, but because of the wife's struggling with her own gender and who she is and her identity, she becomes, she alternates between the partners, and it's set on this couple's honeymoon in this really hot location, and you can almost feel the tension and the oppression and the heat, and yeah, it's a really interesting read. I also now have a book called Eden by Sonia Overall, which has been published this year, which I was hoping to read in the summer, but I never got around to it, but which I really want to read in 2023, which takes this book as its basis and builds on it, and I loved this and I highly recommend it. I haven't read any other Ernest Hemingway, so I don't know if I like him in general as an author, but I really loved this. Then we have When Women Were Dragons by Kelly Barnhill, another one I read in June. So June was a very good month for me, and this is set in a period that I didn't think I liked reading about, but I think I'm beginning to realise I do like, which is the 1950s. So let's say it's modern historical fiction, and I'm beginning to realise some of my favourite books are set in that sort of 1950s, 60s, changing of traditions to more liberal attitudes. I love that sort of thing. So like On Chesil Beach by Ian McEwan is set at a similar time. This one takes the communist tensions of the time and things like HUAC and McCarthyism, and then adds in this element of women turning into dragons and how it's not allowed to be spoken about, and it plays those off against each other so well. I thought it was so fantastic, and I only picked it up because I was trying to find a book for a prompt on Whatever-a-thon which included dragons, but I didn't necessarily want to read a fantasy. I do like fantasy, but I wasn't really in the mood for it. So I picked up this that sort of, let's call it urban fantasy or speculative fiction, magical realism. Yeah, so yeah, really loved that. So number 9 on this list is Woman Eating by Claire Coder. This was a library book. I need to own my own copy. This follows a young woman who is a vampire. She's trying to live in the city. She doesn't want people to know that she's a vampire. I don't think anyone knows that vampires are real, but she's trying to live a normal life. She wants to integrate, but she's also well aware that she has to eat blood. And when she tries to starve herself, obviously there are disastrous effects, but it's not action-packed. It's very sort of melancholic. It's very slow, very introspective. So it's not like a horror vampires thriller. It's superbly done. I loved it. And then the final one on this list is Swimming Home by Deborah Levy. Now, funnily enough, when I read this, I didn't think it was as good as some of the other books that I'd read that month, because June was such a good month for my reading. I keep thinking about it, and essentially we have a family that have gone on holiday for the summer to France. At the holiday house that they've rented, another woman turns up, suggesting that there's been a mix-up, or she's confused the date. She thought she was supposed to be getting there that week, but she might be the next week. But they invite her to stay with them, realising that she's got nowhere else to go. But it turns out that she's actually sort of an obsessive fan of the dad, the husband in the family, who is a poet. And she almost writes her own poetry to talk to his, and she wants him to read her poetry. And whilst it's not a thriller in the sense of, in terms of plot, I wouldn't have called this a thriller in terms of plot, but the feeling, the tension, the psychologicalness of it felt like a thriller. Like, I couldn't stop reading this. It was so good. This is published by And Other Stories, which is an indie publisher. But yes, this was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize 2012. So, I mean, I'm just a Man Booker or Booker Prize hoe at this point, aren't I? That was the 10 of my favourite books that I've read this year. And so now I wanted to tell you my most fun reads this year, the books that I just enjoyed reading. Doesn't matter whether they were literary or not, doesn't matter whether I would want to reread them or not. I may or may not in some of these cases, but I just thoroughly enjoyed myself, and I recommend them all the time to people. The first book I'm going to mention is The Wyford Code by Janice Hallett. My mother-in-law lent me this. She said she read it and she just loved it so much. She thought it would be the sort of thing I'd really enjoy. So I did. I read that. I inhaled that. I thought that was excellent. I loved the mixed media nature of it. I love the fact that it was audio files, and that any errors that you hear in it are because of they could have been about the transcription process, or they could have been intentional. And then the way that the ending changes everything that you've read up to that point, I thought it was phenomenally done. I'd love to read some more Janice Hallett. I know my mother-in-law has The Appeal on her shelf, and I know Janice Hallett is also releasing another book this year, so I think I'm going to have to read some more Janice Hallett next year. The next book on my list is The 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turn. I believe in America this is called The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. I don't know why they bothered to change the title, but this is superb. So this year I've read 2 Agatha Christie's. Didn't really love them. This, and he mentions it in his afterword or his introduction, I can't remember, how inspired he was by Agatha Christie. He had a neighbour growing up who used to get him Agatha Christie books, and so this book is heavily inspired by the types of mysteries that go on in Agatha Christie. My criticism of Agatha Christie is that her stories, or at least the ones I've read, are too brief. Like, they're good mysteries, but I think that they're almost intended like short stories. Like, you don't go into too much detail. Whereas I kind of say the most recent one I read, And Then There Were None, I just wanted a bit more. I wanted a bit more detail. I wanted a bit more tension. I wanted a bit more build up to the deaths. I just wanted like a bit more. And I think that even though this includes like a fantasy element, like it's not real, it gives me that extra that I was missing from Agatha Christie. I read this between Agatha Christie books, so I didn't know that that's what I wanted from it. But that is now, having read those two, that is now what I realise I was missing from those. I just thought this was great. I wouldn't recommend it for people who are very classically lovers of Agatha Christie, because for example, I think my parents, who love Agatha Christie, would hate the sort of fantasy element, this sort of Groundhog Day element that happens in it, where he goes back and he has to sort of relive the day over and again. I've seen reviews of this where people have said, oh, it was really boring reliving the same day again and again, but it's not like that, because he's entering the bodies of different characters and living their day, and they all do such different things. They're on this enormous estate, and they're all, yes, there are moments when they interact with each other, and he's like, oh, so that's what this interaction that I had with this character meant last time, and I didn't realise. But in general, they're having such different days, so it never felt like that. And considering this is actually really long, I think it's over 500 pages, or nearly 500 pages. I read this in like a couple of sittings. Yes, so 500 pages. I read this in no time because I was just so gripped by it. Okay, I have like none of the next books because they're all ones I've borrowed. But next we have the Kingdom of the Wicked trilogy. I'm putting all 3 books on here. I will say that the first book, the first time I read it, I didn't like it as much as the other 2. I say the first time I read it, the only time I read it. But when I read that, I didn't love it, but I could see that I liked Kerry Maniscalco's writing. She had a really great way of building chemistry between the characters, and I loved that it was almost like a murder mystery rather than just like a traditional fantasy. It's fantasy romance, but it felt like murder mystery. So I then read the second one because I was suitably intrigued, loved the second one, flew through it, devoured it. I mean, I've mentioned it in previous videos, I'll link them as well. And then last month I decided to pay full price for the 3rd book in the trilogy and flew through that as well. They're quite short books, so there are elements of it where I was feeling like, I wish this had been expanded, or I feel like this was not touched on. For example, when we enter the sort of underworld, the 7 deadly sins kingdoms, each lord, so wrath, greed, envy, they each have their own court. But we never hear about how the workings of normal life are. Like, we never end up in like a village of just normal people working in their court, or, you know, like there's no reference to how any of that is happening. But I think because of how short the books are compared to normal fantasy, that's why that was left out. It didn't detract from the story. I thought the story, you know, I flew through it. I would love to reread these. Especially now, having finished the trilogy, I'd like to go back and read the first one again and see how some of the stuff that's then drawn in to the later books feels upon reread, because there might be stuff that I was a bit like, I didn't really enjoy this about the first book, but then now that I've read all of them, I might go back and be like, oh, okay, so that was a clue about what was going to happen here. Yeah, so they were really fun reads. Next we have a book that I downloaded on a whim. It was £1 or £1.99 on Kindle, and it's called Before and After by Andrew Shanahan. It has like the tagline of something like an end of the world weight loss epic or something. And I was a bit worried that it was going to enter the fat phobia territory, because it's like a parody, or if I thought it was going to be like a parody of sort of apocalyptic stories. But it was so good. And the main character, the character we're following, is what's called a shut-in. He is so large that he can no longer fit through his front door to get out of the house. And he's had the side of his house removed. He lives in a flat, so he's high up, but he's had the side of it removed because he's being taken to a hospital to have his leg amputated. And so the side of the house is removed. He's in like the bundle that they like crane you out with when something happens. Suddenly there is this apocalyptic situation, but he's unaffected. and he has his little dog there with him as well. And around him, he seems to be the only person that's unaffected. And as the story goes on, we start to understand why he's unaffected and why everyone else seems to be. And we get these wonderful interactions between him and his dog. There is hilarity in how, because the big thing that's happened is like, it's kind of like an illness or something's happened to people and they're angry. Everyone is angry and fighting, and some of the like things that people say to each other, the things they shout at each other in their anger end up being really comical. And I laughed out loud at this book. I cringe because there's some awful body horror that happens, because obviously he needed to have his leg amputated. It's the end of the world. He still needs to have his leg amputated. Like, there is some really graphic scenes that, like, yeah, I really enjoyed that. There's a second book. I don't necessarily feel compelled to read the second book. I might do, because I really enjoyed the first one, but it was really good before and after. Loved it. Okay, the next one is The Trees by Percival Everett, which I've read as part of my 2022 Booker Prize reading vlogs. I really loved this. I loved the parody, the satire. I'm trying to think if I've read anything else that feels the way that this felt to read. Maybe Before and After feels a bit similar. So if you liked The Trees, then you might really actually enjoy Before and After by Andrew Shanahan. I don't feel like I need to say very much about The Trees, because if you're interested in the Booker Prize, you've read it or you've heard a lot of people talking about it. But yeah, it's just a very black satire. It's a little bit magical realism. Yeah. The Trees. The next one is Temporary by Hilary Lecter. Another one I borrowed from the library. Would love my own copy, but I read this because it was one of the book choices for the Weird Women's Book Club, which I have joined on Patreon. No, not Patreon, Discord. I can't get hold of the books that they discuss because I have to do it through the library. I can't really afford these books, and full price books that I can't afford to get. So I have to pick and choose the ones that I can get from my library. So I read Temporary. It was so funny. And I suppose this is, again, similar to The Trees. It's like it starts off feeling quite normal, like you're in a normal place. You're following a woman who is working through a temp agency, but very quickly we just spiral into absurdity, and she's temping for the CEO of a company. She's temping on a pirate ship. Like, it is absurd and funny and really well done. I loved that. Number 7 is Case Study by Graham McCrae Burnett. So this is another Booker 2022 book, and I think possibly my favourite one that I've read of the nominated books. So I have read After Sappho, Night Crawling, The Trees, Trust. I think that's it. And then Case Study, and this I think is my favourite. It's got a bit of humour, it's psychological, I could see myself rereading it. I just really loved it. Number 8, so we move into something very different to Booker Prize nominated books, and we've got A Touch of Darkness by Scarlett St. Clair. Soon I will be doing a video where I talk about some of the fantasy romance that I've read in the last few months, because this is the first book in a series. I read this back in May, so I think before I started my YouTube channel, and I really loved it. I thought this was fantastic. It had the romance, it had smut, because if you're going to read romance, you want smut. But it also had some themes going through it about romance when there's a power dynamic. And how can you truly know whether you're in love or whether you want to be with someone when there's an imbalance of power. I just thought it was brilliantly done. I've since then read the rest of the series that are published and hated every single one of them. I continued through because I sort of thought sometimes when you read a series, there's a dud and then it picks up again. No. Read the first one and don't bother with the rest. It's my advice. Number 9, we're nearly there on this first 20 books. We've got Tripping Arcadia by Kit Mayquist. This is a book I borrowed from the library. It's a 2022 publication, I think. And this, I think, is supposed to be a bit dark academia. It's got dark academia vibes. Not that I know very much about dark academia, but it feels dark academia to me. But we have a rich family. It feels a bit Great Gatsby in this idea of affluence and, the excessiveness of money. And then this woman who I think essentially wants to punish the people there. I don't want to say too much. It's written by a transmasculine author, and I just really enjoyed reading something else, you know, something by someone who is not Donna Tartt, or, although I will say I've got The Secret History on my TBR, but, you know, I enjoyed reading something that wasn't classic. The final one on this list of fun reads is Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day by Winifred Watson. Now, I will caveat this by saying there are, I think, two sort of racist sections in this. Quite specifically, Miss Pettigrew meets a richer woman. She gets sort of swept, it's a Cinderella retelling essentially, but she gets swept away into this richer woman's life who has multiple partners, and she can't decide which one she wants to marry, and Miss Pettigrew's advice is go for the most British one because this one has a touch of Jew in him. Like, that's the sort of tone, but it's one section or two sections in it, so it still feels like a fun read, and it wasn't excessively done. It was a mention. So I still feel like Winifred Watson is a racist author, but it's a classic. It's a Persephone reprint, and it's just fun, and it's very quick, and it contains these pretty little sketches in as well, which is it's just a nice fun read, and it's fun to watch Miss Pettigrew go from being on her last penny to living the high life with, I can't remember her name now. Who's the other one? Miss LaFosse. Miss LaFosse. She gets swept up into Miss LaFosse's life, and it's just a bit fun. Okay, the next section is my 3 top short story collections from this year. I'm mentioning in a couple of videos lately that short stories are something I want to read more of. So this year, my 3 favourite. The first one is The Beginning of the World in the Middle of the Night by Jen Campbell. Head and shoulders above any short story collection I've ever read. I've never enjoyed so many short stories. I think there was 1 or 2 in the whole collection that I was a bit like, not for me. The rest of it was just so beautifully done. It's magical realism. I'm sure you've seen Jen Campbell's channel. She's fantastic. So it is diverse. It has different representation in it. But it's magical realism, and it's lovely. It's just wonderful. I really need to own a copy because I don't own a copy. The second one is Eros Unbound by Anais Nin. Now, I didn't like every story in it, but I can't stop thinking about the collection. And it's because, this is touted as being like classic erotica, but what it really feels like is much more literary. It feels much more a woman sort of pushing the boundaries. Like, there are certain scenarios in these stories that don't feel erotic. They feel taboo. They feel dangerous. And so I'm quite intrigued by this idea of pushing what is traditionally given to us as this is what romance should look like, this is what a sexual scene should look like. And I'm very interested in Anais Nin's writing. So this is a weird one to put on this list because, as I say, I didn't like every story, but it's really got me thinking. It's really thought-provoking, and I want to read some more Anais Nin this year. And then the final one that I'm going to mention on the short stories is John Wyndham's The Seeds of Time. This is 9 short stories. I have this because I really loved The Day of the Triffids, which I read a couple of years ago. Absolutely loved that book. I've got a few more John Wyndhams, but this is his short story collection. And what's interesting about this is he wanted to take the sci-fi genre and add in elements of different genres. So each story has a different twist. So, for instance, there's one where he's tried to weave in a bit of romance. There's one where he's tried to weave in comedy. There's one where he's woven in horror. And so each of the 9 stories has a different sort of feeling about it. Again, I didn't really enjoy the romance one, but I enjoyed the way that he was playing with the genres and the way that he was exploring. So I thought it was absolutely brilliant. Okay, we're on to the best classics. Now, I do need to mention that this would be 5 classics because I have already mentioned The Garden of Eden by Ernest Hemingway and Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day by Winifred Watson. But these are the 3 other ones that I wanted to mention. So we've got Animal Farm by George Orwell. This, again, had me laughing out loud. There were scenes in this that I just thought were hilarious, like the character called Snowball, who is basically the dictator, and the ways, when he's being brutal and harsh, but he's called Snowball. There's like lots of little bits, and I think this would be a very good reread and going deeper and reading it much more slowly. So that's the first one I want to mention. Sorry. Annoyingly, my camera cut out on me and cut out a middle clip from a whole video, so I don't really know what happened there, but I'm just gonna fill in the gaps and then it will go back to previous me finishing the video. So the second book on my best classics of 2022 was Passing by Nella Larson. This is a story about people of black heritage passing as white. It's sort of split into 3 sections. I found the first part not great, and I was a bit like, oh, I don't really think I like this. But then the second part and the third part were phenomenal. What I really loved about it was that it was comparing the ways in which some women who are passing judge another woman who not only is passing but has married someone who's incredibly racist and would like leave her and maybe even beat her if he knew that she'd deceived him. But then these other women are in relationships that are very oppressive, basically in this sort of male-female power dynamic. And I loved how that was played off against each other, so I really enjoyed that. And then the third book that I wanted to mention for my favourite classics was Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. This is my first Virginia Woolf and I'm now absolutely obsessed. It's not an easy read, it takes a lot of concentration despite being such a short book. Because it's so stream of consciousness, things can get interrupted whilst you're reading it because someone comes across some traffic lights or, you know, they need to cross the road. So it's very disjointed, but I think it's really well done. And yeah, I just really loved it. Can't wait to read some more. The next section that I want to talk about are my favourite audiobooks. I've got 5 to share with you. The first one I wanted to mention is The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. Now, this is a very Marmite book. Some people really love it. I really loved it. And then other people feel that it's not a great depiction of mental health. And I just think that's down to personal preference. The audiobook is narrated by, I can't remember what her name is now. She plays Daisy Buchanan in The Great Gatsby and one of the roles in Never Let Me Go. I'll put her picture up, but her voice is perfect for this character. It is just phenomenal. And now you'll go back to the remaining clips for the rest of the video. The second one I wanted to mention is The Institute by Stephen King. So I've recently realised how much I love Stephen King's books on audio. I've never read physically his books, but I love them on audio books. So I've now got a few more, but I've read The Institute and Under the Dome on audio. Loved them both. The third one is Plain Bad Heroines by Eliza M. Danforth. Emily M. Danforth? Anyway, now this is an enormous book and I think I'm also beginning to realise that I like these sort of epic volumes on audio. I think that's a theme I'm sort of picking up about myself. Yeah, and I've heard a lot of people talk about this by saying that they found that apparently there's a lot of footnotes in this book. So you'll be reading the story and then suddenly you'll have like an enormous half page of footnotes. In the audiobook, that's not a problem. It flows very well. So I don't know if I'd get on with this in physical copy. I would like to try it in physical copy because I've heard there are illustrations and all sorts in there. But yeah, so I really enjoyed that. The next one I do now own in physical because I loved it so much and I asked for it is Leave the World Behind by Rumaan Alam. And this is sort of a psychological thriller. It's supposed to be sort of an apocalyptic end of the world thing, but you don't know if there's an apocalypse. It's because it's so isolated, you don't actually know whether anything has really happened. You've got to trust or not trust the word of this couple who've turned up. Yeah, so I will be really reading this one day because this is brilliant. And the final one I wanted to mention was Sense and Sensibility. I'm not a big classics reader and I've never read any Austen, but there's a collection that Audible, Amazon have done of Jane Austen's works. First one is Sense and Sensibility, and I just really enjoyed it. I thought it was brilliant, and I would actually quite like to own a copy now of Sense and Sensibility so I can reread it one day. The next section we're going on to is non-fiction. So I've got my 3 favourite non-fictions of the year. 2 of them are from very early in the year and one of them is a university one I've been reading for one of my essays. So the first one is An Uneasy Paradise, Living on the Waterways. This is by Sebastian and Louise, who live on the canalways in a houseboat. And all of the photographs in this are taken on analogue. They've converted their houseboat into a dark room so that they can quickly put up the dark stuff and make their own prints, do their film developing. And this is part sort of love story towards living on the canalways, but then also there is an essay at the back talking about all the difficulties faced by those who live that way. The ways in which regulations are really making it much more difficult for people to live in the way that they love. And it's really eye-opening, but also really well done. And I think it's fantastic. The next one is Hold Still This is published by the National Portrait Gallery and is a collection of photographs taken through the pandemic. So you may have seen in another video that I did that I created my own one. These I started 2 years ago. So before this was published, I didn't really know that there was much being published other than little zines from people. But since I started making it, I've seen many more of these being published, and I'm sort of making it a bit of a mission to collect them. So I have quite a few pandemic related books and zines in my collection now, but this is the best one that I found. This is amazing, and these are not necessarily analog, they are mostly digital, but some of them even, and what I loved about it was that some of them are just pictures taken on people's phones, so they're not necessarily the highest quality, but they're really telling a story. They're really showing the reality of living through the pandemic in the UK. So we've got some frontline workers, we've got people at home, we've got people in very different situations, people awaiting emergency care that couldn't get it because of the pandemic. There were multiple times through this where I was reading the little sort of story that goes along with it and I cried, and I don't cry at books, but this was emotional, it's beautiful, and as I say, it is the best. If you want a photography book on the pandemic and you didn't buy mine, this is the one that I recommend. It is phenomenal. And then the final non-fiction that I want to recommend is actually one I haven't finished yet, but I already know it's going to be a favourite, and that's Fantasies of Femininity, Reframing the Boundaries of Sex by Jane M. Usher. And this feels like it was written for me, so it's a look at some of the stuff that women have been told, the ways in which we are expected to perform in life. But it starts, and it's told almost chronologically, starting with growing up in, say, the 90s and the early 2000s, and the sorts of women's magazines and teenage magazines that were being advertised to us. So I feel like this has been written exactly for me at my age and the things that I've experienced. It's really good. And yeah, I've not read actually that much of it, but I can already tell from the writing style, from the ways in which things are being investigated, that this is going to be a favourite. And then the final book that I'm going to talk about today, and this, so I realised that I haven't read enough translated fiction. That's going to be one of my goals for next year, is to read more translated fiction. But I wanted to give you my favourite translated fiction of the year. Where everything else I've given sort of 3 or 5 or even 10 books, this one I can only give 1. That's not because I only read one, but it's because it's the only one I've thoroughly enjoyed, and that is The Mad Women's Ball by Victoria Mass, and translated by Frank Wynne. This is one that you'll have seen if you've watched my book haul I got for Christmas, because yeah, it was just one of the best books. So it almost made it onto one of my top 10 lists, but I still wanted to mention it because it is the best translated fiction. It's still one that I want to reread, one that I want to own. Yeah, so there we are. Soon I'll be doing some videos on some of the books that I want to read in 2023 and my reading plans, like the goals that I'm setting myself for 2023. They are not based on numbers, they are based on, say, genres and things that I want to experience more of. Yeah, so looking forward to sharing my 2023 reading with you.